Hello everyone! Today we are going to discuss Michael Ross' book The Oil Curse: How Petroleum Wealth Shapes the Development of Nations. Today the oil states are 50% more likely to be ruled by autocrats and more than twice as likely to have civil wars as the non-oil states. They are also more secretive, more financially volatile, and provide women with fewer economic and political opportunities. The goals of this book are to explain what exactly is meant by the oil curse, why it has such a great impact on countries, and what can be done to turn that natural resource wealth from a curse to a blessing. There are many theories explaining the roots of political and economic problems of oil states, but none of them stands up to scrutiny. For example, some observers blame the foreign powers that intervene in oil-rich countries and manipulate their governments. However, we have conclusive evidence that the United States, Britain, and France have periodically invaded or supported coups in many oil-producing states, most recently Libya, but they have been equally likely to invade countries without oil. Others fault the international oil companies that exploit these resources in pursuit of extraordinary profits, though especially nationalization of oil industries of the 1970s made the problems of the oil states a lot worse. According to the author, the aspect which is really important is petroleum revenues. He distinguishes their four main qualities. The first one is their massive scale, which makes it easier for authoritarian governments to silence dissent and can also lead to violent insurrections when citizens from oil-rich regions want a larger share of these immense revenues. The second feature is their source. Oil-funded governments are not so much financed by taxes because their petroleum possessions can easily cover all the needs. Thus, without being constrained by the citizens, the probability of a non-democratic regime is greater. The instability of oil revenues also matters. Due to the volatility of world oil prices, governments of oil-rich countries frequently squander their resource wealth. And finally, the secrecy of petroleum revenues has a great impact. Making, so to say, secret treaties with international oil companies to hide their transactions is a common practice among the governments of oil-producing countries. This allows oil-fueled dictators to stay in power as there is no clear evidence of their greed and incompetence. Ross traces the oil curse to the upheaval of the 1970s when oil prices soared and governments across the developing world seized control of their country's oil industries. It is necessary to mention that before nationalization, oil-producing countries looked much like the rest of the world. They were ruled by dictators, had civil wars at roughly the same rate as other countries, offered to women more or less the same kinds of opportunities. Their economic growth rates were both stable and well above the world average. Speaking about the consequences of nationalization, despite the fact that oil-rich governments became larger, richer, and more powerful as they gained greater control over their national assets, nationalization transformed their finances in such a way that instead of collecting taxes and royalties from foreign companies, governments could fund themselves by selling oil through their national oil companies, which also helped to keep their revenues in secrecy. Thus, for their citizens, the results were often disastrous, as that made easier for governments to silence dissent and hold off democratic pressures. Moreover, the growth of oil revenues produced new jobs for men, but not for women.
To develop the ideas of the previous speaker, let's go through the point that the more petroleum an authoritarian country produces, the less likely it will make journey to democracy. And after, why entire oil production can affect the status of women in a country. From late 1970s to late 1990s, a wave of democracy swept across the globe, bringing freedom to countries in every region, except for petroleum-rich countries of the Middle East, Africa, and former Soviet Union. From 1980 to 2011, the democracy gap between oil and non-oil states grew even wider. To answer the question how authoritarian rulers in oil-rich countries stay in power for so long without democratization, Ross says that oil enabled them to increase spending at the same time reducing taxes, buying the loyalty of armed forces. To tell the truth, citizens tend to support governments with larger budgets and lower taxes, Oil production leads to a rise in non-taxes revenues, enabling governments to deliver more benefits to citizens without taxes. That allows maintaining popular support and avoiding democratizing rebellions. However, petroleum does not block democratic freedoms. A handful of oil-rich developing countries have still made transitions to democracy, most recently Mexico and Nigeria. It's worth mentioning that Latin America is a great exception from the rule, because oil production countries there are democracies now. One exception that even more interesting is early Russia. In Russia, the drop in oil and gas revenues helped to rapid the government's 1998 bankruptcy. But the weakness of the government's finances also opened the door to greater civil liberties, freedom of press, and meaningful political competition. Once the Russian oil industry began to recover in 2000, democracy began to deteriorate. Moving to the issue of women's rights, it's better to start with the fact that as countries get richer, women typically gain more opportunities, both economic in the workplaces and political, to serve the government, for example. However, not in oil-rich countries, claims Michael Ross. Since the early days of Industrial Revolution, millions of women have entered the workforce by taking the low-paid jobs in factories that produce textiles and garments. In 1890, women held over half of jobs in the US textiles industry. This was the first step for women to ladder on economic, social, political improvement. Today, over 80% of the world's textiles and garments workers are women. On the other hand, in countries which growth was from the beginning based on the sale of gas and oil, didn't produce jobs for women and even blocked path toward gender rights. The Dutch disease, simply the specialization, causes a country's exchange rate to rise and its agriculture and manufacturing sectors to lose their overseas markets. Thus, the kinds of factories that are most likely to hire women on low-wage labor now become unprofitable because of this Dutch disease. Nonetheless, not all oil-rich countries fit this model. In many Western countries, women can find work in service sector and government. In Norway, for example, the oil boom of the 1970s created new jobs in medicine and social services that were often filled by women. However, in countries where women face barriers to work in the service sector, oil wealth nullify economic, social, and political progress, and many of these countries are in the Middle East and North Africa. But also important to say that not only oil might influence the status of women. There are also such factors as country's income, its level of democracy, and historical, cultural, and regional factors, including the presence of Islam.
This chapter shows the conflict of people at the state level, which are generated by the desire to capture more for themselves and their people to improve the quality of life. All this is facilitated by slow economic growth, large population, and any other factors that hinder development and production. The thesis given at the beginning of this paragraph describes the main cause of wars and civil strife: money. Money rules people and forces them to do anything to survive. The author also notes the other factors of conflict development such as ethnic and religious diversity, inequality, democracy, and political instability. But still, the material situation is more important, as the author notes in the paragraph Theory of Civil War, where he talks about oil and its impact on people. He talks about citizens who want to get more income and about the current ruler who wants to stay in power. In this case, civil wars occur, affecting the struggle of the government and the rebels who express discontent. For example, you can go back to the 1920s, when Britain and France drew the borders of Iran and Iraq. This was an under colonial rule to ensure their control over territory and resources. All this led to the creation of states that were rich in oil and gas. But later they were faced with the problem of the ethnic composition of the population, leading to separatist sentiments that provided the country with a propensity for civil war. Iran has also faced occasional separatist violence from Azeri and Arab territorial minorities, while Iraq has seen endemic conflict between Shia and Sunni populations. Both have had multiple wars for control of the central government, because oil wells played a central role in the foundation as states, which may help explain their lamentably frequent violence.
The author argues about the correlation between the natural resource wealth and economic growth. author later observes that economic growth in the resource-rich countries wasn't slow but volatile. It was determined by the rising and falling oil prices, so that the countries were not able to plan their strategy for a long period of time. He mentions the Hartwig rule, which makes countries reliable only on their natural resources, and this makes their economy dependent on the oil crude prices. It is important to mention that the author noticed the skyrocketing population growth in the oil-rich countries. The rise in the population determines the economic growth, but it doesn't mean that the population's overall well-being is growing. On the contrary, the population starts to face poverty. Also, Ross mentions the absence of democratic institutions in oil-producing countries, but says that democracy do not have so much influence on economic growth. State bureaucracy leads to corruption, information secrecy, and leads to the weakness of the state, which outcomes in the decrease of economic growth. Author comes to a conclusion that oil resources do not slow down the economic growth of the country. The inability to secure the state with strong institutions, reduce corruption, establish more control over the price volatility makes the state's economic growth lower. But these factors are applicable also to non-oil countries. Oil wealth does not affect all countries equally, but it is obvious that the Hartwig rule makes the states more vulnerable in the terms of their economic growth. They are reliable on the oil prices, but at the same time they face many other problems. That is why the so-called oil curse exists.
At the end of it all, we can only say that every person, whether he is a citizen or the head of the country, wants to live in comfort and richness. But because of an oil democracy and citizen rights are being pushed away, that is why it's better to build state's economy not only by producing oil, but also giving more attention to another factors of making profit.